I moved into the old Whitmore house on Elm Street about 3 months ago. It was a quiet neighborhood, or so it seemed. The house next door had been vacant for years, according to the local gossip. But soon after I settled in, strange things began to happen. It started with noises. Every night, around midnight, I'd hear footsteps in the house next door. They were slow, deliberate, like someone with a heavy, dragging gait. At first, I thought perhaps someone had finally moved in. But a peek through my bedroom window always confirmed the house remained dark, the windows like dead eyes watching. One night, the footsteps stopped right by our adjoining wall. Then, tapping. 3 slow, rhythmic knocks. Tap, tap, tap. It echoed through my quiet room, making my heart race. Curiosity mixed with fear, I knocked back. Silence. Then, a scrape, like a chair dragging across the floor, and the footsteps resumed, fading away. The incidents grew more frequent. Lights would flicker in my house, my dog would growl at corners and the cold spots. They'd appear out of nowhere, leaving goosebumps on my arms. One evening, I saw her, an old woman, in the upstairs window of the house next door. She was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow pits of darkness. She stared right at me, and I felt a chill that went deeper than bone. The next day, I asked around. No one had lived in that house for over a decade since Mrs. Whitmore died. They found her in that very upstairs room, sitting in her rocking chair, overlooking my now bedroom window. Her death was ruled natural, but rumors swirled about the old woman's obsession with the occult, her pact with something unholy for eternal vigilance over her property. That night, the tapping returned, more insistent. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Armed with a flashlight, I went over. The front door was unlocked, creaking open at my touch. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with dust and decay. I made my way upstairs, each step groaning under my weight. The door to the upstairs room was ajar. Pushing it open, I stepped inside. The moonlight cast eerie shadows, but there she was, in the rocking chair, facing the window. Her ghostly figure turned to me, her face contorting in rage or warning. I couldn't tell which. I ran, out of the house, back to safety. But every night since, I feel her watching, and the tapping. It never really stops. Sometimes I wonder if she wants something from me, or perhaps she's warning me of something far more sinister, lurking in our quiet neighborhood. Ever since the Harrisons moved in next door, things have been off. At first, they seemed like the ideal neighbors. Friendly, always smiling, and eager to help with community events. But then, the screams started. At first, I thought it was just their kids playing too rough. But as the weeks went by, the screams became more frequent and more terrifying. One night, the screams jolted me awake. They were loud, desperate, filled with a kind of fear that makes your blood run cold. I lay there, heart pounding, debating whether to call the police. But just as I reached for my phone, the screams stopped abruptly. Everything went silent. Too silent. The next morning, I decided to pay the Harrisons a visit. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I needed to know everything was okay. I walked next door and knocked. Mrs. Harrison opened the door, her face pale, a forced smile plastered on her lips. Behind her, I could see Mr. Harrison in the living room, sitting perfectly still, staring right at me with an unnerving intensity. I asked if everything was okay, mentioning the screams from last night. Mrs. Harrison laughed, a little too loudly, and assured me everything was fine. Just watching a scary movie, she said. But her eyes, wide and darting, told a different story. That evening, I kept watch. The sun set, and the house next door seemed unusually quiet. As darkness enveloped our street, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Figures, 4 of them, dressed in dark robes, entered the Harrisons' house. None of them were the Harrisons. Hours later, the screams started again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I called the police. When they arrived, the house was silent once more. They knocked, waited, and finally forced their way in when there was no response. I watched from my window, heart in my throat. The officers emerged a long time later, their faces grim. They found the Harrisons in the basement, bound and gagged. The house was otherwise empty, no sign of the robed figures. The police said it looked like some sort of ritual had been interrupted. The Harrisons were rushed to the hospital, alive but traumatized. The next day, a for sale sign popped up on their lawn. They left without saying goodbye, leaving behind more questions than answers. Sometimes, late at night, I think I see figures in dark robes walking down our street, heading towards where the Harrisons used to live. And sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I still hear screams, echoes of terror that linger in the air. The rhythmic crash of ocean waves had always been my lullaby, living by the secluded stretch of coastline that housed the ancient weathered homes of Cliffside Lane. The house next door, once occupied by old Mrs. Carmichael, had been a particular curiosity, with its overgrown garden and stories of maritime glory days long past. After her peaceful passing, the house sat empty, windows staring like hollow eyes, until the night the Vanburys arrived. The moving truck appeared during a dense, creeping fog that seemed to swallow the sounds of the sea. The Vanburys, a couple shrouded in as much mystery as the fog itself, brought with them an air of unease. They rarely ventured out, and when they did, their presence was spectral, barely noticeable, their features obscured beneath wide-brimmed hats and heavy coats. Curiosity and a sense of neighborly duty compelled me to attempt an introduction. However, my knock was met with a fleeting glimpse of Mr. Vanbury, his eyes sharp and penetrating, his mouth set in a thin line, before the door swiftly closed. That night, and every night thereafter, a haunting organ melody played from their home at precisely midnight. The music, discordant and melancholy, seemed not just to drift but to seep through the very walls of my home, disturbing my sleep and setting my nerves on edge. One restless night, drawn by a mix of fear and intrigue, I found myself outside their home, the melody pulling me like a siren's song. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I pushed it open, the old wood groaning under my touch, and stepped into a dimly lit foyer that smelled of salt and something faintly metallic. I followed the eerie music down a narrow hallway, the walls adorned with maritime relics that seemed to watch me pass. The haunting notes led me to a back room where an antique organ sat under a dusty chandelier, its keys moving independently as if compelled by unseen hands. But it was the room's center that halted my steps and sent a chill through my core. A large cylindrical tank, filled with dark, swirling water, dominated the space. As I approached, the water calmed, and within it, I saw a figure, a woman, her skin ghostly pale and eyes closed as if in deep slumber. Her long hair floated around her, and her lips moved slightly, as if she were whispering secrets to the deep. Mesmerized, I watched as her eyes fluttered open, revealing orbs as black as the abyssal ocean. The room seemed to grow colder, the organ music louder and more insistent. Panic surged within me, and I stumbled backward, my gaze never leaving the figure in the tank. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and the music crescendoed into a deafening pitch. I fled the house, the music echoing in my ears, and didn't stop until I was safely inside my own home. I called the police, my voice shaking as I recounted what I had seen. When the authorities arrived, they found the house silent and abandoned. There was no sign of the organ, the tank, or the Vanburys. The only evidence that someone had been there at all was a set of wet footprints leading from the house to the cliff's edge, where they disappeared. The house next door stands empty still, its mysteries unexplained and perhaps better left undiscovered. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the fog rolls in thick and the sea whispers, I hear the faint strains of an organ playing from the abandoned house, and I wonder if the Vanburys ever truly left, or if they had ever been human at all.